Well, hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking a little about Neanderthals and what they are, at least in relationship to modern humans. I'm going to give a brief overview, a little bit about 15 minutes sort of mini lecture. So let me do a screen share with you. Okay, so we're talking about, the Neanderthal mystery. And the mystery, I think, to modern science is, really how close were they to anatomically modern humans? What are the real differences? And the question is, why are we the last, hominin standing on the planet right now? Essentially, what happened to the Neanderthals? So, the Neanderthal discoveries have been around for quite a while. Here is probably one of the second largest discoveries called Angus II. It was found in Belgium. Now, there is an Angus I, and actually it was delivered to Carl von Linné. Carolus Linnaeus, the inventor of the systematics, the taxonomy, and even back in his time, in the 18th century, he thought that it wasn't actually a modern human, when he was actually looking at it. And when this skull was found in 1829, the discoverers looked it up and they interpreted also as a modern human. However, as Darwin's sort of age began to come into sort of full view as his writing of, the origin of species, the skulls themselves became into more, close, sort of review, and one person in particular, which is Thomas Henry Huxley. He's considered Darwin's bulldog. He's sort of his voice, and made this statement about this particular skull, which at that time they really weren't sure what it was. Probably, modern sapiens. He says a man of low degree of civilization. Now, when we hear statements like that, particularly from Thomas Henry Huxley, who had a big voice within the community, he sort of sets in the model for what a human is, sort of in public consciousness. Now, as new finds were to come sort of into scientific view, and Darwinism, the impact of Darwinism began to progress, particularly with Darwin's second book, which discussed the origin of humans. Another skull was found just about the same sort of particular period of time, which is called Neanderthal I. This is a classic Neanderthal. It was found basically in the Neanderthal Valley near Klein Kozlogroto. It is a remarkable find. We're having a pretty complete portion of the skull cap, which shows this long, low, a cranial vault with very massive supraorbital torus. And its interpretations were very interesting. For the very first time, people were realizing there's something very different. We have a different type of human, not within our species. An argument abounded, and generally what won out was that it should be a new species, Homo neanderthalensis, which was named after the valley in which it was discovered. What was interesting is sort of a summary, overview, I think is sort of put out by this guy named William King, who really was the person that labeled it the Neanderthal, because he sort of did all sort of the overall synopsis, if we can say, about opinions about this thing. And basically what he thought is that it really emphasized the ape-like sort of appearance of this skull, and that it was much closer, to apes than it was to humans. He thought definitely it was a human ancestor, but mostly more clear sort of ape origins. Thus began even greater thinking about the idea of these things being nasty, brutish, and fierce. So, following on the heels of these sorts of statements, images began to leak out into public consciousness, and what's in the public consciousness also oftentimes ends up in the scientist consciousness too. So images like these, like we look at one that's relatively late on the scene. Here's 1909. This is a reconstruction of a Neanderthal skull, based on this behavior. You can see this, Brutus thing up in the rocks in the caves, grisly and sort of fierce. And when we think about, the idea of the caveman, this sort of image, this is really what engendered it. And, we do find a lot of Neanderthal skulls and artifacts within caves, simply because there's a high preservation bias. It does not mean that they're not elsewhere within the terrain. But, this really wasn't a common, a widely held, conception. And they saw these things as cave-dwelling, brutish, stupid individuals, at least part of the interpretation. Now, look over on the right-hand side. This is actually an earlier 1888 reconstruction of a Neanderthal male. This is a little different view. This is a more humanized sort of view, right? You get the idea that you're looking at something here more closer into human origins, at least the modern side, not towards the ape side. So, we have these two sort of incompatible interpretations. Now, this sort of interpretation, although it was done, well over 100 years ago, up until relatively recently, you would find within the scientific community, either those that would hold to this nasty and brutish, very different type of human, or something very akin to the right-hand side, which you're looking at, which was a Neanderthal, which is very much like anatomically moderns. Right? So which one is it? And how science has gone about sort of elucidating the differences between the two? But we have to remember that the real baggage, the negative consequences, is still with us today. After all, my former girlfriend, always refers to me as a Neanderthal. So that's the baggage we have from the past. We've been imprinted on our modern populations in a cultural context. Right? So let's talk about irrefutable facts. What do we actually know about these? Solid, without any argument. No, Neanderthals have been around, beginning something like 400,000 years ago. I mean, and really, recognizable Neanderthal full form, probably 300,000. And they were around to about 35,000 years ago. That's their window until extinction. Now, these anatomically modern sapiens, which we are, right, we share a common ancestry with Neanderthals, and that would be a species known as Homo heidelbergensis, who had an African origin. Right? Those forms of heidelbergensis that stayed in Africa went on to the evolutionary trajectory to give rise to anatomically modern humans. Those heidelbergensis, which ventured out of the African context into Central Eurasia and into Western Europe, did evolve into, a very interesting form called the Neanderthals, which are a cold weather adapted form of humans. There are derived physical characteristics which basically explicate exactly what a Neanderthal is, which we'll look at, as well as some unique behavioral traits too. And we'll talk a little bit about, are these primitive traits are derived to fit within the context of where they're evolving at. Right? Now, one thing that for sure is that there's been a big debate over tool making technologies, right? Who had the capability of making what and when. So modern humans sort of landed in one sort of camp of abilities. And at about the same time that we're encountering Neanderthals, a new sort of technology comes around called the arachnation. All right. So the arachnation is a more advanced technology. Normally we would associate with Neanderthals. We use bladed tools. They're very difficult to make. We have very finely intricate design tools, almost little handhelds, and rests on them that allow us to manipulate them better. And they're anatomically well designed or ergonomically well designed. And we see a lot of highly specialized tools, drills and punches. And we saw a lot of things that are designed for different sort of tasks, not just only meat cutting, but sawing, and doing very special tasks. And evidence where we have bone that's being used and worked in a certain way to where they can be hafted, and crafted into where they can be used as projectile points. And things come with sort of an element of style to them too. They're worked far beyond the normal utilitarian sort of stuff. There's a style to them where they're putting extra emphasis in it. So there's a symbolic consciousness sort of associated with these arachnation tools used by anatomically modern sapiens. Right. This is just a group here that was found in Italy. Okay? Now, with Neanderthals, there's a more primitive technology, we call it, called the Mustarion. Now, they aren't, bladed tools. They are tools which are made by what we call the lava technique. And basically, you take a rock, you pre-shape it, get all the angles and everything you want, kind of pre-shape it in the design you want, a nice thick rock, and then you strike it on its side and you try to get a flake to come out that's in the design of the tool you're trying to make. Okay. Now, this is less cognitively challenging than something like, the blade technology of the arachnation. And this is essentially what we see in possession of Neanderthals for a long period of time. But remember, these tools are around even before anatomically modern sapiens evolved. And they were, of course, in the possession of Neanderthals, throughout Europe. But here's the issue. Is that, recently we've been finding that the Neanderthals are in, have the capacity of actually making the Aragnacion technology. Specifically, this guy named Julian Real Salvatore was working in Italy. And what he found were Neanderthal sites in which, for a long period of time, for 100,000 years, they're making Listerian, technologies. And then there was a switch, there's a shift to an Arachnacean human-like technology, but it wasn't just human, not being copied from humans. They made their own, right? It had a unique Neanderthal style to it, a different sort of origin. They uniquely invented their own sort of forms of Arachnacean, which are just as intricate. And we also find out that there is no human interaction because the time periods in which they were making these things were before there would be human contact in the area. And once we do have sort of the start of this new technology, which we call the Eleusinian sort of wave, it begins to spread up north through Italy. So other Neanderthal groups are acquiring the technology, learning it, and pass them on. So we do have the ability for co-cultural transmission. And, and also within these toolkits too, you have to remember, we're looking at, things like ochre, things with color, and ornaments too, and some shell. So we're looking at some ideas, some behavioral complexes of symbolic consciousness, which normally are assigned to purely modern sapiens in Neanderthal populations, right? And also the breadth of diet is pretty good too. We have evidence of a lot of fishing, not only big game hunting, but also small game hunting, and most likely gathering too, which sort of fits the modus of existence with anatomically moderns as they are going to be in this area later on. Now, we talk about symbolic consciousness. We really want more than just tools sometimes with style, but how about absolute artistic capability? Yes. We have a site here in Gibraltar, about 40,000 years old. It was made by Neanderthals. Those are purposeful artistic engravings on the floor of the cave. Now, in addition, we have numerous sites where we have bird feathers and talons and all sorts of things that are not going to be associated for day-to-day use for utility stuff, but would have been symbolic. Were they evidence of some sort of religious thinking? We're not quite sure, but they're symbolic. There's a symbolic consciousness. And other areas, such as in the southwest Spain and Alveols, we have ochre, marine shells. And these shell containers are filled with lots of different sorts of pigments and residues, which are likely used for adorning objects, as well as perhaps even face painting, which is the first sort of evidence that we have of carrying social information about the person is being carried out externally, which was thought to be a purely anatomically modern trait, which we can see in Neanderthal populations. This indicates surely some form of symbolic culture. Now, how about, advanced things about like medicine? Well, that's a very tricky thing to talk about. We do have skulls of individuals. One's Lafres, and it's a skull of roughly a 40-year-old man, who has lost most of his dentition on one side and would not have been able to chew his own food, but he had, lost his dentition for probably at least a decade. So, members of his group would have had to process and prepare his food for him, and he was well cared for. So we do know we have lots of compassion and love in these societies. But how about the real strict use of some medical technology? Well, we found this mandible here, and this mandible is very interesting. It's from Spain, another stronghold of the Neanderthals. But what we find within dental calculus are penicillin. Yeah, there's penicillin mold at least. And the only way in which we think we can get there is for Neanderthals knowing, how to mix ingredients correctly to get the mold to grow, and then biting into the teeth and gums to try to conquer periodontal diseases, gum diseases. And it appears to be very effective. So, while they probably don't know anything about microbiology, neither did modern humans up until maybe the 17th century, they're highly aware that experimenting with different ingredients can have beneficial effects. Now, what's interesting too, though, is that we are the last humans standing, and despite all the, the glory we can give to Neanderthals for, some sort of form of symbolic consciousness, we had to figure out what happened to it. Well, first, it wasn't quick. Now, this is a direct quote here from William Coleridge that Neanderthals did compete on par with humans, and for thousands of years they did. And where we see cohabitation, at least not in the same, actually they're not living together. They never have done that, but they're in the same geographical region, exploring the same resources. So generally a regional cohabitation for thousands of years, right? Now, if humans had some overwhelming intelligence, the Neanderthals would have flushed off, immediately. But it seems that sometimes the Neanderthals might have outcompeted humans. We see early humans coming in sometimes and making sort of these rough starts and disappearing. So what we have to think about is the differences between the Neanderthals and humans have been greatly overemphasized, just based on what we can see about occupation. Okay? But at the same time, we are the last human standing. So we need to figure out this question, of why and what happened to the Neanderthals. All right, so I'm showing you pictures of the postcranial elements of Neanderthals versus humans. I don't think we want to even look at the cranial stuff because it biases us, right? That's the idea of the images. The nasty Bruce is short can overwhelm us without seeing the actual, the physiology of the skeleton, the kinesiology, what these things are actually designed to do. Right? So Neanderthal on the left, modern human on the right, and the anatomically modern humans we see, the cylindrical more shaped of the thorax, and the rib cage. This is not what we see, in Neanderthals. It's flaring, right? It's sort of a little slightly funnel, barrel shaped, and it extends much more, inferiorly, down to the skeleton, closer to the hip. And additionally, when we look at the hip, the innominate bones, and particularly around the iliac crest, we see the crest sort of sticks up and reaches around and more of a sort of a heart-shaped sort of design. And the spinous process is off the lower lumbar. The lumbars extend further out, which shows the connective tissue that anchored these things was very strong and robust to hold muscles which are very thick, but relatively short. And that indicates strength. Excessive strength for particular type, of maneuvering, which is, short jabs, which is, what we think the way in which they hunted by the sort of projectile points they were making, the larger blades, hafted onto something fairly short and stiff, in which they would jab into Pleistocene, fauna, including the megafauna. Now, the thing about it is the longer the muscle, the more flexibility you have, but the less strength you have. Thus, for the Neanderthals, you would have wanted to have very strong, muscles, and therefore you're going to give it some flexibility. This is not so with the anatomically modern humans. In fact, studies by Joe Rhodes and Steve Churchill, two researchers, and they're very good, kinesiologists, have indicated a much greater flexibility, particularly when throwing, the idea of winding up, something that Neanderthals probably would not have done very well. Thus utilizing technology such as spears would have been, in the wheelhouse of the anatomically modern, but not within the Neanderthal wheelhouse. And it would be a matter of intelligence. It wouldn't matter of body limitations. Thus, when we think about how these two are encountering each other, we have to think about how they're encountering their game. With anatomically modern humans, when they move into an area, they're able to take shots with spears at 70 to 120 feet and get, reliable, gain from that. They're going to be able to feed themselves, which is a greater distance than the Neanderthals we're thinking about. Well, they may be limited to something like, an ambush kill between 25 feet and at most, if they can check us, maybe 30 feet, right? Well, over time, when you think about that, the game itself is going to be, modifying its behavior through natural selection, simply because humans are going to be getting, certain animals in which are going to be more, less aware of the presence of humans and giving them closer range for the kill. Over time, through natural selection, the game will begin to move further and further and further back, and eventually moving away from what Neanderthals are likely able to do. They're not able to hunt that long distance. And really what we see, after several, millennia, which really what it would take to modify, game behavior like that, Neanderthals, begin to starve. We can see that in skeletal health and population decline. So it might be just the advent of a new body in a particular context, right? Not necessarily the mental processes that gave the humans the upper hand on Neanderthals. In most locations in which we see them, particularly in the larger strongholds of Neanderthals, in the context of France. Okay. Now, modern advantages. What are the modern advantages? Well, potentially group size. Neanderthals are, from what we understand, live in relatively small group size compared to humans, 10 to 30, 30 max. On average, 13 to 15. Here's a site right here in La Rochelle, France, which is really Normandy, on the Normandy coast. We're looking at footprints, watching the movements, finding individuals, and they determined there's about 13 people living here, which is an average group size for a Neanderthal. They're also determining who's in camp most often too, so they can talk a little bit about, biological sex and roles and what's sort of happening. Now, it's very similar in some ways to humans, besides the group size for our social organization, except now while humans are living in much larger groups, the groups are at higher density. So there's more groups per area too. So humans are more adept at living closer together and in larger groups. This may imply that we're better at we're more intensive on the resources. We're able to, get more out of the environment intensely than Neanderthals do. It's a possibility for this, right? That does sort of indicate a higher complexity of thinking, right? Or it may actually indicate difference in psychosocial needs. Humans just have this typical pull together force because we need each other more. There may be that, and despite doing that, it might be to our detriment sometimes. And we can see living in highly urbanized areas aren't always the healthiest things for humans. Okay? Now, discharging the weight of that argument about this too is that we have indications of is that, as far as delegations of duties of what's going on, females tend to do a lot of hunting within the Neanderthal societies. And that's risky, dangerous business. In fact, when we go, we find, Neanderthal skeleton remains. They're usually broken up into pieces, lots of skeletal injuries and fractures, which we don't see in anatomically modern populations. Now, if females are out hunting, they're acquiring these breakages, these problems, which risk their lives and their health. In other words, they're not going to be taking care of their young, to adulthood, or actually ensuring their survival, or the fecundity, the insurance of they're going to actually be reproducing as often as humans. Thus, their reproductive rates are less than humans. And we can see that in overall populations. By the time anatomically modern humans arrived, with the Neanderthals 60,000 years ago, the populations were basically around 70,000 individuals across the entire continent, which is relatively low. When anatomically modern humans move in, by the time we get, to the time that we get to the expulsion or the extinction of the Neanderthals, we're several times that number. Which indicates that we simply might have out reproduced them and really swamped them because of a reproductive issue and role issues within their societies. All right, okay. Now a lot more work needs to be done, within these areas, sort of tease all of this stuff out. But one thing is for sure that we know about the genetic evidence, that there has been integration between Neanderthals and modern humans, right? We do have a genetic imprint because we hybridize with them. There are two main pulses. It's 60,000 years ago during the Levant region, which is the Near East, so Lebanon, Israel to Syria, that general region. We do have a lot, of pulse integration, and then we have it in the western edges of the margin of the continent around 35,000 years ago, before the extinction of the Neanderthals. Okay? We'll go into the sort of the demographics of what that might be about. Let's consider what the legacy is, within our own sort of genotype, our genome. Well, while everyone has a different component of Neanderthal DNA, generally it should be heterogeneously sort of scattered across all of our chromosomes. So what we find is that there are significant areas which we call, depletion deserts, in which there are no Neanderthal DNA whatsoever, which is really interesting. Because this really implies that individuals that get, Neanderthal DNA or had DNA in those areas were, in extreme deficit for survival. And through differential reproductive success, of course, were eliminated. Now, there are large sections of these too, which means the incompatibility, with Neanderthal DNA with humans. Now, as far as the psychological stuff, how they differ, at least in the behavioral thing, we can just look here at chromosome number 7. A very large depletion desert, one of the largest ones. And this is home to a very important gene known as FOXP2. And this really, regulates human neuronal differentiation, right? How neurons are sort of, constructed and weave together in patterns, or how they're sort of linked together. FOXP2 is an incredibly important gene for that. It also links linguistic processes too. Right? So that we've noticed that impairments in humans, mutations in humans of FOXP2, lead to orofacial impairments where we don't do the correct linguistic processing, things don't make sense whatsoever, and there's a definite deficit in actual reasoning. Okay? Well, there we go. So we see those depletion deserts, and we know there's an incompatibility, in what's happening up here in building, two different sort of consciousness. There sort of may not be incompatible, in the building processes, which means the behavior is quite likely to be fundamentally different between Neanderthals and modern day humans. What that is owed to a great deal of speculation. I'll tell you one thing, that what I believe and what I've seen, within the archaeological record, is that the high ability for abstraction, things like we use like metaphors, would be something that the Neanderthal would not be privy to. A statement such as "the world is your oyster" might give you a reply from a Neanderthal that no, the world is not yours and the world is not an oyster. Probably very astutely said, because they don't understand sort of the hidden meanings and metaphors in which humans use at a very high symbolic order. And this may be, besides some of the small physical adaptations, they are a cold weather adapted species, and we're more of a warm weather adapted species. Other than just those two components, there may be very little difference indeed involved. But it's those two slight things and error that did lead to the demise of the Neanderthals. We can also think about Darwin too, lastly, on this, that he did mention, and it is something we hold to, is that generally we're going to have one species per niche, right? And obviously, when we're looking at humans, and anatomically, in modern humans at least, and Neanderthals, that we were in the same niche. We're procuring the same resources. So competition ultimately would have been very fierce. And the length of time that it takes to eliminate one species, was talking about similarities and differences. The extraordinary length of time that Neanderthals were alongside humans is very, very long, indicating that they were extremely close to us, a very close cousin indeed, but thinking slightly differently. Well, one thing about this, it gives us a lot of room to think about, what sort of careers we can have in anthropology, as well, especially young students like yourselves, moving forward, lots of careers, particularly in this area, because, nothing has ignited the imagination more, in biological anthropology than the Neanderthal mysteries. All right. So a little summary here, that Neanderthals certainly deserve to be elevated from what we thought about them before. Okay. And, they are not irrelevant to the expansion of anatomic modern humans. There's a phenotypic legacy left in our bodies. And there's a lot of Neanderthal genes that do a lot of different things, both good and bad, which we will explore in a different lecture, right? And additionally, as well, the expansion of modern humans into the new frontiers was altered probably very significantly in the timing by the presence of Neanderthals. But at the same time, we see the physical morphology as well as surface organization sort of mark some differences, and then we can start seeing some of these differences, but they're slight. They're not as large as we thought they were before. Now, also we have to think about this too. The advantages that modern humans have, might be very context specific. That means, we had a big advantage at that particular period of time in which we encountered Neanderthals because of the conditions. The technologies that both of us acquired, technology of which was still very low, even with humans, compared to what we have now. I think about, computers, guns. Yeah, but if Neanderthals were here now, given the technologies that we have and they possessed, not a hunting spear, but a rifle, the use of computers, the use of everything, it'd be hard to tell, who would have the advantages in the modern day world, because context is actually, everything. All right, so that does it for today. I'll look forward to seeing you guys in the next lecture. So let me stop the screen share and I'll see you guys.